My name is Sharon. I'm 72 years old, living in a small town on the outskirts of Oregon. A place I once thought would be my peaceful home for the rest of my life. But on the seventh night after my husband passed away, during a dinner I cooked out of habit like I had for decades, my daughter-in-law set her knife down, looked me straight in the eye, and said, "Now that he's dead, pack up your past and get out of this house." My son didn't say a word. He just nodded. The whole room fell silent, like someone had taken the air out of it. My granddaughter still held her spoon, wide-eyed, and asked, "Where's Grandma going?" Have you ever felt like the entire world turned its back on you right at the moment you were at your weakest? If this story speaks to you, leave a comment below, hit like, and subscribe to the channel, because what they did next, you won't believe. I stared at the cold food on my plate, but my mind drifted back to years long gone. Those days when just one look from Richard was enough to make me feel loved, protected, and seen. Richard was never a romantic man. He didn't shower me with gifts, never remembered our anniversary dates exactly, but he knew I preferred my coffee weak, that I always placed a thin blanket underneath because wool made me itch, and that I hated the sound of ticking clocks at night. He remembered every small thing. In nearly 50 years together, I never once had to wonder if he cared about me. We met in the fall of 1971 when I was working as a library assistant and Richard had just started at a local architecture firm. He walked into the library asking for The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. I told him that book was always checked out, but if he was interested in a conversation about architecture and the human ego, I could talk to him through my entire lunch break. He laughed, and we talked from that lunch break onward and never really stopped. 4 years later, we got married. He bought a small plot of land in the southern Oregon hills, an area that wasn't even zoned at the time. Richard said, "I want you to live in a place where I designed every wall, every window, a place where the sunlight hits the bedroom at exactly 6 in the morning, just the way you like." And we built everything, every house, every fence, every garden, together, with friends and families who trusted Richard enough to buy land around us. We didn't just build homes, we built a community. People started calling it Henderson Street, even though that name never appeared on any official map. But to us, it was home. Jason was born in 1981, our only child. He was a quiet kid, more into books than playgrounds. Richard used to carry him on fall walks, show him how to cut wood, measure roof angles, and choose the house's direction based on wind. He was Richard's whole world. And I believed for the longest time that we were Jason's world, too. Everything started changing when Heather came into the picture. Heather was the type of woman people admired from afar, beautiful, sharp-tongued, and fully aware of how to command a room. At first, I tried not to judge. Jason loved her, and that was enough. But then she started inserting herself into every detail of his life. She didn't like the old house, said we should start thinking about moving to the city. She called the neighborhood Richard built unnecessarily nostalgic. Worst of all, she told me I was an overly emotional mother who smothered Jason. I'd truly tried to get along. I took her to the spa, asked for her opinion when buying gifts for Emma, cleaned the whole house to host her family for Thanksgiving. But nothing was enough. She quietly pulled Jason away from us by postponing get-togethers, canceling trips at the last minute, always with excuses. Work, Emma's sickness, being too tired. Richard noticed before I did. Once, after Jason canceled a dinner we'd planned months in advance, I was cleaning up and Richard just shrugged and said quietly, "I think it's time we prepare a backup plan." I didn't understand him. I shook my head and said, "I don't want to believe our son is drifting away from us." He didn't argue. He just held my hand tight. In recent years, he became unusually attentive to our financial documents. He'd wake up early, sit at the desk, and review every statement, every contract, every insurance policy. When I asked why, he simply said, "I just want to make sure that if anything happens, you'll never have to depend on anyone." I used to think he was being overly cautious, Now I see. It was the instinct of a husband who knew everything was slowly slipping away. After Jason married Heather, he visited less. The short calls revolved around work, Emma's school fees, or a request for a small loan. Richard never refused, but I knew every time he signed a check, it broke his heart. Emma stayed sweet and affectionate, but her visits to Grandma's house dwindled. She was too young to resist Heather's control over the family calendar. Then Richard had a stroke, after what seemed like a minor cold. He passed in his sleep, neat and peaceful, just like the way he lived. I thought that after all we'd been through, the family would rally around me, would hold me, share in the grief. But they didn't. Just days after the funeral, I was told to leave the very home Richard and I'd built. With our hands, with our love, with our youth. And now, sitting alone in the kitchen, still smelling faintly of tomato sauce, I am no longer the woman who once bent over backwards to keep the peace. I am the wife of Richard Henderson, and I have questions that need answers, papers that need reviewing, and a plan I never knew existed, but one that was carefully prepared for this exact day. I can't pinpoint the exact moment everything began to fall apart, but maybe it was the day Jason looked at me and no longer had the eyes of the boy who used to crawl into my lap whenever thunder shook the windows. The morning after that dinner, while I was still rinsing dishes from the night before, Jason came over. He didn't knock. He walked right in, wearing a white shirt buttoned unevenly, holding a folder. I was still at the sink, hands wet. Jason didn't look at me right away. He placed the folder on the dining table, Richard's favorite breakfast spot, then turned and said almost mechanically, "Mom, I want to have a serious talk." I gently wiped my hands on the kitchen towel and sat down. "Serious about what, honey?" Jason took a deep breath, eyes scanning the backyard. "I think you realize by now, living alone here doesn't make sense. This house is too big, wasteful. Heather and I are trying to find a stable place to raise Emma." I stayed quiet. That wasn't a suggestion, it was a decision already made. "You want me to leave?" I asked softly. "It's not about wanting," Jason replied quickly, as if everything had been rehearsed. "It's about needing to. We need space. Heather works from home, Emma's starting middle school. We need room for a study, an office, a backyard for a pool. This house has potential, you get that, right?" I nodded faintly, but my heart felt like it dropped into a canyon. "So? You've already planned this?" "Don't overreact, Mom. This is the most logical option." Jason paused, then added, as if tossing me a rope to preserve my pride. "We'll help you find a better place. There are lots of great senior living communities, with meals, doctors, and people your age. You won't be alone." "You think I need a nursing home?" I asked with less restraint. Jason leaned back in the chair, sighing. "Don't call it that. It's just more convenient. You're not young anymore." That sentence hit harder than Heather's cold command to pack and leave. Since when did I become a burden? Since when did the place Richard and I built brick by brick become usable space? "I can't just leave right away," I said, trying to stay calm. "I need time to think, to prepare." "I understand. But it can't drag on. 2 weeks should be enough, right?" Jason stood up. "Heather's contacted a few people. They can help pack, rent a moving truck. Don't worry about it." I looked at him like he was a stranger. "You planned all of this without asking me a single thing?" Jason stayed silent, then looked away. "I'm just doing what needs to be done." The very next day, Heather showed up with a group of strangers. One of them, wearing glasses and holding a laser measure and an iPad, spoke in a cold, clipped tone. "We could knock down this wall, in the living room, open it up to the kitchen, gets a better price." Another woman, dressed in high-end clothes, walked around snapping photos. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, watching them enter every room as if I didn't exist. Out in the backyard, Heather turned to me with a smile so thin it might have snapped. I know this feels sudden, but trust me, you'll feel relieved not having to worry about all this. You don't really need this backyard anymore, do you?" I didn't answer. I just looked at the cherry tree Richard had planted the year we celebrated our 30th anniversary. Every spring, it bloomed with white petals. It was under that very tree that Richard had once placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "Even if the world changes, I'll always build a place that belongs to you." A few minutes later, a for sale sign was driven into the front lawn. I stared at it, alone under the noon sun, like a bold declaration that I had been replaced, pushed aside. That night, I went to my room, turned on the bedside lamp, and sat down without taking off my shoes. Every corner of that room still held Richard's presence. His pillow still had the indentation from his head. The wooden dresser he built still carried the faint scent of varnish. I picked up our wedding photo frame, my hand trembling. I used to think losing Richard was the worst pain I could endure, but now I understood. Worse than death is being treated like you've already died, by the ones still breathing. I sat frozen in the quiet of that room, the soft glow of the lamp casting light over the photo on the nightstand. The silence was so thick I could hear my own heartbeat. Outside the window, the wind stirred the trees in the backyard, their leaves trembling, like they knew what was coming. I stood up and opened the bottom drawer of the dresser, the one where Richard kept important documents. Under an old cloth was a tiny key, rusted on one edge. I picked it up, a chill spreading across my palm. The wall safe was hidden behind a painting above the bed, something I'd looked at for years without ever thinking twice. The lock still held the faint imprint of Richard's touch. My fingers shook as I slid the key in and turned. A soft click echoed. The door creaked open. The smell inside, a mix of old paper, steel, and varnished wood, hit me like a wave. It was the smell of the past, of secrets, of a man who had prepared for something I had never dared imagine. Inside was a stack of documents bound with worn fabric and, on top, a letter in Richard's familiar handwriting, slanted, a little rushed, like he had written it in his final clear hours. I sat on the edge of the bed, hands trembling as I unfolded the letter. If you're reading this, then they've shown who they really are. Don't panic. You're stronger than you think. Start with land file number 324. Everything we built began there, and it's also protected from there. You know what to do. Richard. I sat still, my heart pounding like waves crashing against rocks. File number 324. That was the first piece of land Richard ever bought. It was where we built our first home. From there, the entire Henderson neighborhood grew. But why that one? Why did he believe I would know what to do from there? I carefully pulled out each document from the safe and laid them on the bed. There was a notarized copy of his will, land ownership records, hand-drawn lot maps with dates and Richard's signature. But one thick folder stood out, separated in a brown file cover. The front read, "Property solely owned by Sharon Henderson, plot 21. I froze. 8 lots? I opened it page by page. My name was clearly listed as owner Sharon M. Henderson. Each parcel had notary seals, legal marks, even transfer records from Richard's private company to my name, dating back 5 years. I had no idea. All the assets had been removed from the shared estate long ago, and the only legal owner was me. I suddenly remembered one time, years ago, when Richard asked me to go with him to the attorney's office to sign some home insurance papers. I hadn't paid much attention. He was always cautious. I skimmed through and signed where he pointed. Now I realized I hadn't just signed insurance papers. I had signed over ownership of everything he wanted. The home I lived in, the 2 rental homes next door, the house Jason and Heather were living in, and 5 more at the end of the block. They all belonged to me, in my name. I clenched my fists, heat rising up my neck. My emotions were more than surprise or gratitude. It was something close to rage, something sharp. They were trying to evict me from a house they thought belonged to Jason, but not just this house, every house they walked past each day was legally under my control. I jumped up, grabbed the small filing cabinet in the corner, and pulled out Richard's old work journal. I flipped to the page marked with the asset transfer date, and there it was, in blue ink, his neat handwriting. Tom holds the originals, Margaret Morrison has the digital backups, everything authenticated. Tom had been Richard's longtime assistant and site manager. Margaret Morrison had been his head accountant since his private firm started. They were the two people he trusted most. I dropped back into the chair, gripping the letter, feeling like Richard was still in the room with me, placing a steady hand on my shoulder and whispering, "You're not alone. I planned for this." I knew I had to act. I couldn't stay silent while being pushed out of a house that legally bore my name. I couldn't let people who once called me Mom treat me like I didn't exist. I packed the documents into a leather case, locked it, placed it back in the dresser, and looked at the wall clock. It was nearly 10 p.m. Tomorrow would be the beginning of something new, and I wouldn't walk blind. I would open every door, read every word, and follow every trace Richard had quietly left behind for me. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The air was still cold, mist clinging to the porch railings. I brewed myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, Richard's old spot, where he'd unfold the morning paper and tilt it so I could see the headlines. I didn't open the paper today. I opened the leather case I had locked the night before. One page at a time, I read slowly, carefully, like I was breathing in Richard's last words through ink and parchment. I didn't call ahead. I needed to see it for myself. The county land records office was about a 20-minute drive through tree-lined roads. The woman at the desk, Denise, looked to be in her 50s. She greeted me politely as I explained why I was there. I need to look up property records for the Henderson Street lots, specifically plots 3 through 24, through 331, I said, keeping my voice steady. Denise nodded, typing in a series of numbers. After a moment, she looked up, brow slightly furrowed. "Are you Sharon M. Henderson?" "Yes, I am." She looked at me more closely, then turned her monitor toward me. Her voice had a note of surprise. "You are listed as the direct owner of the entire row of properties, 7 houses total. Each asset has a complete record of transfer, with the most recent notarization dated 5 years ago." I took a deep breath. It wasn't a dream. "Including lot number 327? The one currently occupied by Jason Henderson and his wife Heather?" I asked, though I already knew. Denise double-checked the file, then nodded. "That's right. That property is under your name. There hasn't been any legal transfer of ownership since Mr. Richard Henderson signed it over to you. It still fully belongs to you." I leaned back in my chair, letting the mixture of relief and grief wash over me. Richard had planned it all, quietly, thoroughly, without a word. While I was soothing the baby to sleep, preparing Thanksgiving dinner, wrapping birthday gifts for the family, he had stood firmly in the shadows of our life, building a shield I didn't know I'd need. "I'd like a printed copy of all these records, along with detailed maps of each property. And if there are any mortgage agreements filed against these properties within the last 2 years, I want to review everything," I said. Denise looked a little surprised, but she didn't question it. She began printing out stacks of documents, handing them to me one by one, like puzzle pieces I was about to piece together under a harsh light. I was just going over the record for house number 328 when Denise paused, her expression turning cautious. "Mrs. Henderson, there's something you might want to know." I looked at her, a ripple of unease tightening in my chest. "There's a mortgage on file for property number 329. It was recorded 14 months ago. The borrower listed is Jason Henderson, acting as the legal representative of the property owner." She hesitated, glancing up at me. "But according to the official record, the house still belongs to you." It felt like someone had driven a blunt force straight into my chest. "Let me see a copy of that contract," I said, my voice no longer calm. Denise handed me a printout from the system. Right on the first page, I saw Jason's name, his signature unmistakable, and underneath it, the words, "Legally authorized representative of Sharon M. Henderson." I flipped to the next page. It was notarized. But the section for ownership authorization, the document that would grant him power to act on my behalf, was completely blank. There wasn't a single record of me ever giving him that authority. I looked up. "How much is the mortgage on house number 329? Denise checked the file. $120,000. Borrowed from a private commercial bank. The loan is still active. The interest rate is fairly high. I gripped the arm of the chair, my palm ice cold. Not only had Jason and Heather taken over the house I was living in, they had used another property under my name to take out a loan, completely illegally. I stared at the signature on the mortgage contract. My eyes blurred. Not from age, but from the sting of betrayal mixed with a fury I hadn't felt in years. Jason hadn't just turned away from me emotionally. He had chosen to deceive me, systematically. "Would you like me to connect you with a legal office that can help verify the signature?" Denise asked gently. I nodded. "From now on, I want a full verification of every single asset I own. Thank you for your help." I gathered all the documents, thanked Denise again, and left the office carrying a heavy folder. But the weight wasn't just paper. It was broken trust. It was the painful reality that motherhood had been twisted into a tool, and it was a truth, one no one wants to believe but can no longer deny, that the same child I once cradled in my arms had become the one using those arms to push me out of his life. I sat at the dining table, surrounded by documents, sunlight pouring through the window, casting light over every file as if exposing truths long hidden. The coffee in my hand had long gone cold. I had just returned from the county records office, my head still spinning from the discovery of fraudulent mortgages Jason and Heather had taken out behind my back. I was scanning through every detail when the doorbell rang. I walked to the door, wary. A man stood outside, tall, broad-shouldered, with snow-white hair but sharp, alert eyes. It took me a moment to recognize him. "Thomas?" I whispered. He smiled, his voice deep and warm. "Hello, Sharon. I wasn't sure you'd remember me." I chuckled softly and stepped aside. "Of course I remember. You were Richard's best friend from law school. You two argued for hours at our 25th wedding anniversary because he said you always wrote contracts that were way too long." Thomas laughed as he stepped into the house, taking in the kitchen like he was searching for old memories. "I still remember that walnut tart you made that night. Richard once told me it was his favorite, especially after losing an argument to you." We sat at the table among my half-organized files. Thomas glanced at some folders where his name appeared and grew serious. "I came because of all this, Sharon," he said, pulling a thick envelope from his coat pocket. "Richard came to see me 3 years ago. He had a feeling. Not suspicion, but a sense." My hand trembled as I took the envelope. "What kind of sense, Thomas?" "That if something were to happen to him, there was a chance your son wouldn't act like a son should. Richard didn't want to leave things in the usual way. He asked me to help him build a legal, secure, and airtight asset protection structure." I stared at him. I had always known Richard was cautious, but I never imagined he had gone this far. Thomas pointed at the papers on the table. "What you have there are copies of what I prepared. But this," he tapped the envelope in my hands, "this is the original, notarized and sealed at my firm. Richard stated that if any heir exhibited signs of disrespect or engaged in civil violations regarding the estate, full management rights would immediately revert to you, with no need for probate or intermediary trustees." I slowly opened the envelope. Inside were agreements, stamped and signed in perfect order, every clause written in precise legal language. One particular clause stood out. If any heir attempted to interfere, forge, or manipulate the protected estate, they could face civil prosecution and be stripped of all inheritance rights. Jason mortgaged a property that doesn't belong to him. I said quietly, almost to myself. And he did it with a forged signature? Without any document giving him permission. Thomas nodded solemnly. Then it's time to activate what Richard put in place. This isn't symbolic. It's legally binding. And if you want, I'll represent you in court. I looked him in the eyes, a burning steadiness in my gaze. Do you think Richard truly believed this day would come? Thomas paused, thoughtful. I think he didn't want to believe it, but he was clear-headed enough to prepare. His love for you wasn't loud or flowery. It lived in the numbers, the pages, the documents he built. He didn't protect you with his hands, Sharon. He protected you with his mind, with the law, with backup plans no one ever noticed. I drew in a deep breath. The house felt still, like it was listening. I looked down at the stack of papers, almost sensing Richard behind me, his hand on my shoulder. Nodding. What now, Thomas? I asked. He leaned forward, eyes sharp as ever. Now it's time to follow through on his plan. I no longer felt confused. The pain of betrayal still lingered beneath the surface, but now it was replaced by something far clearer. A purpose. Richard had laid the foundation, Thomas had confirmed everything was legal, and now it was my turn to face the raw truth of what Jason and Heather had really done behind my back. That evening, I started going through all the old bank files Richard had saved on a portable hard drive. He had a habit of downloading monthly statements from every joint account we shared. I still remembered how he used to plug the hard drive into his computer, carefully saving each file into folders labeled by date. Back then, I thought he was just being overly meticulous. Now, I knew it was his final line of defense, to protect me from what he feared might come. Inside the folder labeled Joint Accounts 2019 to 2023, I began noticing red flags. Dozens of small transfers, between $300 and $1,500, were being pulled from the joint account Jason and I had opened 10 years ago to manage family expenses. These were being sent to an unfamiliar account. At first, I assumed it belonged to Heather, for groceries or bills. But when I ran that account number through an online financial verification tool, the result made me freeze. That account was registered solely under Heather's name. I opened up the monthly statements. The transfer frequency spiked around holidays, especially after phone calls from Jason asking for money for Emma's education fund, or when Heather claimed they needed to repair the roof or install a new water system. None of those funds had been used for the family. They were quietly being funneled into Heather's personal pocket. I dug up old emails from the bank, ones I still had access to from Richard's time, and that's when I discovered something even more alarming. There were 2 mortgage loan records under my name. I hadn't signed any loan paperwork in over 3 years. I called Thomas first thing the next morning. He kept it brief. We need to verify those signatures. That afternoon, I went to a handwriting verification office for analysis. The specialist there, after examining both contracts, didn't sugarcoat his words. Mrs. Henderson, both of these signatures show signs of being forged. The strokes are too rounded, and the slant doesn't match your right-hand habits. This looks like someone deliberately tried to imitate your writing. I left the office with a preliminary report and expert conclusion. For the first time, I didn't just feel heartbroken. I felt like a true victim of a crime committed by my own son and daughter-in-law. That night, I sat in the living room. The silence in the house was chilling. I thought of Richard's words from his letter. You know what you have to do. I did, but I also needed more solid proof. I called an old friend, Charlotte. She had worked as a supervisory assistant at the local investigative bureau. She gave me the contact for a trusted private investigator, Mr. Raymond Kerr, a former police officer with 25 years on the force before starting his own agency. The next morning, I met him at a small cafe on the edge of town. He was around 60, neat, calm voice. I don't want this dragged into the press, I told him. I just need the truth. Raymond nodded. Give me a week. I'll monitor all transactions, communications, and movement if necessary. 4 days later, he called back. We have a bigger problem than I thought, Mrs. Henderson. I invited him over. He laid out a series of surveillance photos on the table. Heather stepping out of a small hotel in Eugene, arm in arm with a tall, well-dressed man, clearly a businessman. In the next set, they were dining together, then sharing a kiss near a parked car. My skin went cold. That weekend? Jason had told me they were at a family training camp with their daughter. That man is Mark Dillard, Raymond said. A financial consultant, divorced, and based on messages I lawfully retrieved through your home's IP address, Heather is planning to file for divorce right after she resolves the asset situation. I felt hollow inside. Every suspicion I had, now laid out in front of me in photos, financial reports, and even a detailed timeline of how they planned to push me out so they could legitimize control over something they never truly owned. Raymond placed one more folder on the table. This is what I thought you'd want to see first. It was a set of bank statements from an account Heather had used to transfer funds to the Bahamas, an offshore investment account under Mark Dillard's name, her lover. And in the transaction notes, one line read, "Ready once house clears. Divorce timing aligned." I laid my hand on the table and took a deep breath to steady myself. The room felt smaller, not because I felt diminished, but because I knew that from this moment on, I wasn't on the defensive anymore. I had evidence. I had legal counsel. I had Richard's preparations. And most importantly, I had the truth. The truth didn't need protection. It only needed the right moment to be revealed. I never imagined I'd walk into court as a plaintiff. My whole life, I believed family conflict should be resolved through dialogue, through trust. But when the person across the courtroom is your own son, and what he's sacrificing isn't just kinship but the honor and legacy of someone deceased, silence is no longer an option. Days after my last meeting with Raymond, Thomas and I sat down to organize all the evidence. Every statement, recording, photo, sorted, labeled, indexed. Under 4 categories: forged signatures, unauthorized transfers, misappropriation of property, and systematic financial fraud. Thomas carefully reviewed each applicable law. Though retired, he still had ties to a major law firm in Salem. He selected 2 young, energetic attorneys, both experienced in handling internal corporate fraud cases. Together, we filed a lawsuit with the county court, demanding to cancel all mortgage loan contracts tied to properties under my name, citing forgery and unauthorized representation. To file criminal charges against Jason Henderson and Heather Henderson for financial fraud, signature forgery, and unlawful use of property. To expose Jason's unpaid debts to Richard's company and seek restitution under the terms of his private loan contract. A week later, the court accepted the filing. The summons was delivered to Jason's address via certified mail. I wasn't there when he received it, but according to a neighbor, Jason stood frozen at the mailbox for nearly 5 minutes, pale-faced, holding the envelope. That evening, Heather called me, or rather left a voicemail. Her voice was tight with anger and fear. "What the hell are you doing? You're dragging everything into court just to prove a point. You're tearing this family apart, Sharon." I didn't respond. The next day, Heather hired a private attorney from Portland, apparently someone who specializes in high-asset inheritance disputes. She filed a counterclaim with the court, trying to dismiss my case on grounds of unclear internal family dynamics and possible emotional manipulation of an elderly woman. Thomas just chuckled when he read it. They think they can scare you with phrases like, "elderly emotional manipulation, Sharon, you should be proud." They see you as a threat worth fearing. Our first court hearing was on a windy Monday morning. I wore the dark brown coat Richard had bought me during our final trip to Monterey. In my bag was the original set of documents, prepared the night before, each tabbed with colored labels. Jason sat across from me, avoiding my gaze. Heather, in a pale gray suit, sat next to her lawyer with a stony face. She didn't sit near Jason, something Thomas noticed immediately. I caught Raymond's eyes from the back row. He nodded. We were ready. My lawyer began the presentation. Unauthorized loans, forged signatures, properties mortgaged without any legal authorization. Then came the set of documents I had kept sealed until now. A detailed loan record between Jason and Henderson Construction. Your Honor, my attorney said as he laid down the originals, these are loan agreements between Mr. Jason Henderson and his father's company. As of the end of last year, Jason still owes over $88,000. The judge picked up the file and flipped through it. This is a contract signed by both parties? Yes, Your Honor, signed by Mr. Richard Henderson and Mr. Jason Henderson. Each loan had specific payment schedules, interest clauses, and multiple overdue notices. Jason looked shaken. Heather turned toward him, her face paling. I clearly heard her hiss through clenched teeth. You told me your parents gave you that money? I said nothing. I simply looked at them. People who once sat at my dinner table, ate the meals I cooked, called me mom, and now sat here trying to justify the unjustifiable. When the judge asked the defendants if they had any response, Heather's lawyer stood. Your Honor, my client believes these funds were family financial assistance and therefore non-binding. Mrs. Sharon Henderson is also likely under emotional distress following her husband's passing. Thomas stood up, his voice calm but firm. Your Honor, I witnessed the entire agreement process. I hold the original documents regarding asset transfers and legal safeguards set in place by Mr. Richard Henderson. All assets were lawfully secured. No one has authority over them except Mrs. Sharon. The silence in the courtroom thickened like cold fog. I didn't look at Jason again. I had spent too many years waiting for him to feel remorse. The air in the mediation room was dense, like morning frost on a window pane. I sat at the head of the table between my two attorneys, feeling the chill from the air conditioning, and from the stares across the table. Jason sat on the left, no longer arrogant as he had been at the first hearing. Heather, on the right, had carefully applied makeup but hollow eyes. She hadn't once looked me in the eye since entering. The mediator was Judge Lucinda Reeves, a woman around 60 with a calm voice and sharp eyes. She asked everyone to settle, explained the process, then nodded at me. Mrs. Sharon, you are the plaintiff. Please state your claim. I didn't rush. I opened the leather case beside me and pulled out a set of documents I had meticulously prepared. Each page was numbered, well organized, with notarized copies and supporting evidence. I've never been one for theatrics, but that day I wanted everything stated clearly. No more shadows. I didn't come here to fight. I came to clarify, I began. My voice steady but strong enough to still every motion in the room. All properties on Henderson Street, from number 3 to 4 to 331, are legally under my name, transferred to me by my husband, Richard Henderson. 5 years ago, with legal witnesses and proper documentation. I slid the first folder toward the judge. Here are the deeds, property maps, and current ownership records. Not one of these properties has any legal ties to Heather Henderson. Heather arched an eyebrow but stayed silent. Her lawyer leaned forward. Mrs. Sharon, my client remains the legal wife of your son, Jason Henderson, and is entitled under inheritance. I interrupted, gently but firmly. There is no will granting Jason any property. All assets were separated from the estate beforehand and are my sole legal property. This is the official statement from our attorney, Mr. Thomas Gilbert. Thomas nodded and handed over a set of certified documents. Judge Reeves glanced at them and made a note. I turned to Jason, my voice lower. Jason not only has no legal right to any property, but he also owes me and his father's company over $120,000. I pushed forward another set of documents. These are personal loans spanning 7 years, each with signed agreements, interest rates, and repayment terms. Not a single installment has been paid. Jason sat with his head bowed. I saw his fists clenched tightly. He no longer argued as he once did. Maybe it's hard to deny facts stamped in red ink and signed in black. And here, I opened the final folder, voice steady, is verified evidence from a private investigator and independent forensic experts, confirming that Heather Henderson forged my signature to take out mortgages on my properties without any valid power of attorney. I placed a stack of photos on the table. No further explanation was needed. Several showed Heather with a man named Mark Dillard, pulled from hotel surveillance, alongside bank statements showing financial transactions between them. Heather's shoulders stiffened, her face pale beneath the makeup. I looked at her and spoke slowly. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed the man you claimed to love. Heather sprang to her feet. I don't need your judgment, she yelled, voice cracking. I did it for Emma. I just wanted a better future for our family. Our family? I asked, eyes locked on hers. Your version of family means throwing your mother-in-law out, forging her name, and planning a divorce to split her assets? You think I didn't know? Heather looked around, retreating into her chair, lost. Jason stayed silent, his hands limp. No one else spoke. After a long pause, Jason slowly stood, walking toward me with heavy steps. Then he knelt. No theatrics, just a man facing the ugliest parts of himself. Mom, can you forgive me? I was wrong. I was weak. I never thought it would come to this. I looked at him, the boy I once held, worried over when he had fevers, the one who hugged me after being bullied. But now, what I saw was a grown man, who made his choices with both mind and heart. Jason, I said, voice steady, I used to be the kind of mother who forgave everything. I used to stay silent to preserve peace. I used to believe you'd grow out of it. But I'm not that mother anymore. No one said another word. None was needed. Some fractures can't be sealed with apologies, and broken trust, once shattered, never returns to its original shape, no matter how many tears try to stitch it back. A month after mediation, I officially signed the lease to rent out house number 327 where Jason and Heather had lived. They moved out soon after without saying goodbye. Heather vanished from town quietly. Jason sent a short email. No apology, no explanation, just a few words. I'll try to repay part of the debt. Hope you stay well. I didn't reply. Instead, I spent my time reorganizing the properties. The houses that had once just sat like background props in someone else's life were now tools I could choose to use. I didn't sell a single one, but I rearranged everything. House number 327 was leased out under a long-term contract to a young family from Portland. The husband was a software engineer, the wife a nurse, and they had 2 small children and a golden retriever named Maple. At the lease signing, the wife teared up when I offered to reduce the rent for the first 3 months to help with their moving costs. I simply smiled and said, I used to live in a house full of children's laughter. I know how precious that is. The rent from that house went straight into a private account labeled Jason Henderson Debt Repayment Fund. Every month, the payment would go toward the more than $120,000 Jason owed, until it was paid off. No interest. But also, no forgiveness. I didn't do it out of spite. I did it to teach Jason the lesson he should have learned long ago. Responsibility isn't something you can keep borrowing forever. But there was one person I couldn't be cold with. Emma. I saw my granddaughter again one afternoon at the public library. She was curled up between 2 children's bookshelves, reading Charlotte's Web. When she looked up and saw me, she stood and wrapped her arms around me without saying a word. Mom and Dad won't let me call you, Emma whispered, her head resting on my shoulder. But I miss you so much. I gently held her hand. I miss you too, Emma. Nothing can change that. After that day, I asked my attorney to set up a trust fund for Emma. I assigned one of the houses at the end of the row, number 330, the one Richard had designed as a studio for his art projects, to be transferred to Emma when she turned 18. The house would be locked from use until then, protected from any interference by her parents. I named the property Willow House because of the old willow tree Richard had planted in the backyard. I still remember the morning he said, "I hope someday our grandkids learn to lean on something gentle, not just power." I hand-wrote a letter to include with the legal documents, which the attorney would give to Emma once she came of age. My dearest Emma, if you're reading this, I may no longer be with you, but this house will be yours. A place where you can be yourself, where no one can take it away or tell you to leave the way they once did to me. I'm not giving you a house. I'm giving you a free beginning. I signed the letter, folded it, and felt a small piece of weight lift from my chest. After everything was settled on Henderson Street, I decided to do something Richard and I had talked about for over 10 years but never did. Move to a place near Flathead Lake, Montana. We had gone there the third summer after our wedding. Richard called it the peace after the storm, and I used to joke, "When I'm old, I'll raise chickens by the lake and stop answering everyone's calls." But I was old enough, and too tired to keep answering things that didn't deserve me. The little lake house was painted white with a red wooden roof, nestled against a line of pines and facing the open blue water stretching to the horizon. I'd bought it with the rental income I had quietly saved. It wasn't large, but it gave me a reading room, a cozy kitchen, and a small wooden porch where I could sip tea in the morning and watch wild ducks glide across the lake. I moved in just as fall began. The leaves were turning orange and red, the air cool and crisp, and the water still as glass. I hung a photo of Richard in the living room, one where he was smiling, head tilted, eyes twinkling like sunlight filtering through pine trees at dawn. I stood in the center of the quiet room. No footsteps echoed. No one interrupted the stillness with lies. I was no longer the woman hunched by the fireplace, unsure where to go. I was the one turning the pages of her own story. One morning, I was sitting at a small wooden table on the porch, holding a cup of chamomile tea, when the phone rang. The screen showed an unfamiliar number from Seattle. I hesitated for a few seconds, then answered. A calm, polite voice came through. "Hello, Mrs. Sharon Henderson. My name is Elise Carter, Director of the Women's Empowerment Program at Sage West Coast. One of the attorneys in Montana told us about you and the incredible journey you've been through." I stayed silent, the lake breeze brushing against my cheek like a reminder to breathe deeply. Elise continued, "We're organizing a series of talks about protecting the financial rights and dignity of older women, especially those who have faced manipulation, abuse, or asset theft by their own families. Would you consider being a speaker? We're not looking for perfection. We're looking for someone real." I sat there for a long time after the call ended. Part of me wanted to say no. I'd already closed that chapter. I didn't want to open it again. But something deep inside, like Richard's voice in a stormy night, whispered, "If you've walked through fire and survived, don't keep the flame hidden. Use it to light the way for someone else." 3 weeks later, I stood on a small stage in a community hall in Spokane, Washington. The seats were arranged in a semicircle. About 100 women sat below, most of them between 50 and 70. Some wore simple cardigans, others silk scarves like they were reclaiming a lost identity. Some wore glasses, faces shaped by years of silent endurance. I stood before the microphone, hands loosely clasped. No script, no editor. "My name is Sharon Henderson. I'm 66 years old. I used to live in a big house, the mother of a successful son, the wife of a kind man. But not long ago, I was thrown out of the home my husband and I built for over 30 years by my son and his wife." The hall fell into heavy silence. I continued, each word deliberate. "I didn't realize that love without limits can become chains. I didn't see that silence, sometimes, is the soil where injustice grows. I told my story without stopping. From the dress Heather gave me on my birthday to the document Jason pressured me to sign over dinner. I spoke of the morning at the county office when I discovered the properties were still under my name, of the unexpected meeting with Thomas, the man who helped me reclaim not just assets, but dignity. No one interrupted, no one asked whether I hated my son or if I had forgiven him. Because the story wasn't about blame. It was about opening a door for women like me who had sat in their kitchens and cried in silence after being betrayed by the people they raised or loved. A woman stood as I finished. She had gray hair tied back neatly, a soft olive cardigan, and a trembling but steady voice. I don't have 7 houses to be stolen, but I did have a little home. Until my daughter transferred it to her husband's name and moved me into the garage. I thought I was useless, but today, I know I wasn't crazy. I just trusted silence too much. I stepped down and hugged her, and a long line of hugs followed. We didn't need many words. I understood. They weren't looking for advice. They were looking for the truth. The truth that someone could be pushed to the very bottom and still choose to rise. After that speaking session, I received dozens of emails, handwritten letters, and even a piano piece composed just for me by a 72-year-old woman. She wrote, "The title is Silence Can Explode. Thank you for daring to speak." I began traveling more, not to keep retelling an old story, but to open doors to new ones. I met women who had been tricked by their own children into giving up retirement savings. Women forced out of their homes because their daughters-in-law claimed ownership. Women who signed documents without anyone ever explaining what they meant. Each time I shared my journey, I didn't just see the Sharon I used to be. I saw Richard, I saw Emma, and I saw an entire generation of women who've been labeled as too old to understand the law. I looked into their eyes and said the thing I once couldn't admit to myself. We are not here to be anyone's background support. We are here to exist, to choose, and to say, I still have value. Evening fell gently over the lake. The water shimmered in soft orange and deep purple like the final strokes of a finished oil painting. I sat on the porch of my little house, hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea, leaning against the wooden chair Richard built when he retired. Autumn in Montana carries the scent of pine and ripe apples. It's cool, but not harsh. Like nature knows those who've been hurt don't need sharpness anymore. Just peace. I had just brought in the mail from the box at the end of the path. There were the usual utility bills, a flyer for a senior yoga class, and a cream envelope with a familiar slanted handwriting. Dear Grandma Sharon. I knew right away it was from Emma. She never texts or emails. She still prefers handwriting, just like when I taught her to write birthday cards for every family member. I opened the letter, my hands trembling slightly, though my heart was warm. Grandma, I got an A on my English paper this week and my teacher read it out loud to the whole class. I wrote about the strongest woman I've ever known. You. My friend said her grandma only tells stories about knitting. I told her mine once won a lawsuit to get justice for herself and helped others stand up too. Grandma, I'm so proud of you. I laid the letter on my lap, my heart tightening. In the golden light of day's end, Emma's handwriting seemed to glow. What came next blurred my vision. I remember when I was little, whenever I cried, you never said stop crying. You always asked, where does it hurt? You were the first person to teach me that feelings don't need to be hidden. I promise that when I turn 18, I won't take anything from you. Just ask that you let me stay with you for a few summer months, make tea, and listen to your stories. I laughed out loud. Not a bitter laugh, not one laced with anger. Just pure, like the girl herself. I gently folded the letter and placed it in the small wooden box on the side table, the one where I keep all of Richard's letters, old birthday cards from friends, and Emma's doodles from when she was 3. From the old radio near the window, a familiar piano melody began. Claire de Lune. Richard used to play it every Sunday morning while making coffee. I closed my eyes, almost hearing his footsteps in the kitchen, the clink of mugs, and his off-key whistling during the dramatic part. Memories no longer cut like knives. They became warmth. I stood up, tea in hand, and stepped to the edge of the porch. The lake was still as glass, mirroring a sky shifting into deep wine colors. A wild goose flew across, its shadow gliding over the surface like a weightless question. If you had to start over, what would you choose? I answered without hesitation, even if just in my mind. I would still choose to be a mother. But this time, I wouldn't let kindness become a chain. I heard the faint sound of a small bicycle coming from the dirt road beyond the trees. That was Lucy, my new 82-year-old neighbor who bikes to the post office every morning and always brings 2 baked sweet potatoes. She taught me how to make apple tart without an oven, and once said something I'll never forget. Freedom in old age is no longer waiting for an apology. I went back inside and pulled a notarized stack of documents from the bottom drawer. They were the ownership transfer papers for the second house on my property, the one right next to mine, officially in Emma's name as of her 18th birthday. No conditions, no strings attached. I tucked a small handwritten note inside the envelope. You loved me the right way, not for money, not for the house, not for the meals I gave you, but because you saw me as I am. And that's why this is the only part of my legacy I want to leave. I sealed the envelope, wrote, "Open on your 18th birthday," and placed it in the drawer Emma would easily find when she came to stay that summer. The song on the radio neared its end. The notes softened like an exhale once you no longer have to hold yourself together. I returned to the porch, sat down, and lifted my cup of tea. No longer the wife standing behind her husband's legacy. No longer the mother begging for space in her own former home. No longer the woman proving herself to those who dismissed everything she built. Just me, a woman living in a small house by the lake, with warm tea, beautiful music, a letter full of love, and an open sky that never shut its doors on me. Maybe my story isn't just mine. Maybe somewhere out there are mothers and grandmothers who've stayed silent too long, who've stepped aside, hoping that family love would find its own way back. But life doesn't always run on emotion. It runs on choices. I chose to keep my dignity. I chose to walk away before I was hurt again, and I chose to forgive but not to forget. Because forgiveness is for peace, but remembering is to not repeat. If you're standing at a breaking point in your own journey, as a mother, a grandmother, or just a woman who gave everything for family, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. What part spoke to you? What made you reflect on your own story? I believe that when we are brave enough to speak, others become brave enough to begin. If stories like this stir something in you, consider subscribing to this channel, because family life with all its collisions, forgiveness, losses, and love still has so much more to be told. And I'll keep telling them about hard choices, quiet peace, and the women who dared to keep walking, even when no one else walked beside them.